In a military tent on the banks of the Danube, in the cold darkness of a winter night nearly 2,000 years ago, the most powerful man in the world sat alone and wrote to himself. He was not writing orders, he was not composing dispatches, he was not planning the next day's battle. He was writing philosophy, quiet, private, urgent philosophy, in a journal that was never meant to be seen by anyone but him. His name was Marcus Aurelius. He was the Emperor of Rome, and the words he scratched into his wax tablets by the light of a single clay oil lamp would become one of the most beloved and enduring books in human history. A book called The Meditations, or in its original Greek title, Ta eis heauton, Things to Himself. Things to himself. Not a treatise, not a sermon, not a lecture intended for students or for posterity. Just a tired man, a philosopher who never wanted to be emperor, talking to himself in the dark, reminding himself how to be good, how to be patient, how to endure, how to let go. The tent was austere. Marcus had never cared for luxury, even though all the luxury of the Roman world was his for the asking. The lamp was a simple clay vessel, the kind used by common soldiers, its small flames steady and warm, casting a circle of golden light that barely reached the canvas walls. On the table before him lay a wooden board coated with beeswax, the standard writing surface of the Roman world. He wrote with a pointed stylus, scratching letters into the soft wax, his shadow large and flickering behind him. Outside, the sounds of a military camp at night, sentries calling the watch across the frozen air, the stamp and whinny of cavalry horses in their lines, the distant murmur of soldiers talking around their fires, the creak of leather, the clink of iron, and beneath it all the deep, steady, unhurried voice of the river itself, the great Danube rolling past in the darkness, carrying cold water from the mountains to the distant sea. The camp was called Carnuntum. It sprawled along the south bank of the Danube in what is now eastern Austria, a city of canvas and timber and stone that housed an entire legion, 5,000 men, along with their auxiliaries and administrators and camp followers. Beyond the walls, taverns and workshops and bathhouses. Beyond those, the vast Germanic wilderness, the forests and marshes from which the enemies of Rome emerged and into which they disappeared. Marcus had been fighting here, on and off, for nearly a decade. He would fight here for the rest of his life. He did not want to fight. He wanted to read philosophy. He wanted to sit in quiet rooms and think about the nature of virtue. But the universe had assigned him a different role, and a Stoic does not refuse the assignment. He wrote in Greek, the language of philosophy, the language of Plato and Epictetus, and the long tradition that had shaped his inner life. He wrote not for publication, not for posterity, not for anyone but himself. And yet these private notes, these quiet arguments with his own restlessness and doubt and fear, would survive plagues and invasions and the fall of the empire itself. They would be copied by Byzantine scholars and printed in Renaissance workshops and translated into every major language on earth. They would be read by presidents and prisoners, soldiers and therapists, and by anyone who has ever lain awake at night wondering how to live well in a world that does not always cooperate. Tonight, as your body settles and the weight of the day begins to lift, let this ancient voice speak to you, not as a lecture, not as a lesson, as a companion, the voice of a man who knew what it was to be tired, who knew what it was to lie awake with the weight of the world on his shoulders, and who found in the quiet discipline of his own thoughts a peace that no army could provide and no enemy could take away. Let your breathing slow. Let the room grow quiet, and let the lamplight from that tent on the Danube nearly 2,000 years ago reach across all that distance and settle gently around you now. Marcus Aurelius was born on the 26th of April in the year 121. Into one of Rome's most distinguished families. His full name was Marcus Annius Verus. He entered a world of marble and olive groves and empire, a world where the scent of cypress and laurel drifted through the courtyards of the great houses on the Caelian hill, and the murmur of fountains mingled with the distant hum of the greatest city in the ancient world. His father, a praetor named Marcus Annius Verus, died when Marcus was only 3. It is one of the quiet tragedies of his life, a loss so early that it left no scar he could name, only a faint absence, like the outline where a painting once hung on a wall. He was raised by his mother, Domitia Lucilla, a woman of considerable wealth who chose simplicity over extravagance. She taught him piety and generosity and abstinence from evil, not only from evil deeds, but even from evil thoughts. She modeled a life far removed from the habits of the rich, even though all the habits of the rich were available to her. His grandfather, Marcus Annius Verus the Elder, had served 3 times as consul. He was one of the most powerful men in the Senate. But when Marcus wrote about him decades later, he did not mention the old man's political achievements. He remembered his decency, his mildness, the way he governed his temper. In a culture that celebrated ferocity and dominance, the boy noticed gentleness. Even as a child, Marcus displayed a temperament that set him apart. He was serious without being solemn, curious without being restless, and someone very important noticed. The Emperor Hadrian, that brilliant, restless, sometimes cruel ruler, who spent his reign traveling the vast empire he governed, looked at this boy and gave him a nickname, Verissimus, the most truthful. It was a remarkable thing for an emperor to notice a child. More remarkable still that the quality he noticed was not cleverness or charm, but honesty, the most truthful. As if Hadrian, a man who had seen through every kind of deception the Roman world could offer, recognized in this small boy something he himself could never quite achieve, a simplicity of character, an inability to pretend. When Marcus was about 12 years old, something happened that would alter the course of his inner life. A painting teacher named Diognetus was hired to instruct the boy in art. Instead, Diognetus introduced him to philosophy, not the dry academic kind, but the living kind, the kind practiced by the Cynic philosophers who slept on hard ground and wore rough cloaks and dismissed the entire apparatus of civilized comfort as unnecessary distraction. Marcus was captivated. He began sleeping on the ground himself, trading his soft bed for the bare floor. He put on a rough Greek philosopher's cloak. His mother, with the quiet patience of a parent who recognizes a phase, but also sees something genuine behind it, persuaded him to sleep in a bed instead. She did not crush his philosophical instincts. She tempered them with practicality. A boy wants to be a philosopher. His mother just wants him to get a decent night's sleep. It is the kind of small negotiation between parent and child that transcends centuries, and Marcus never forgot her for it. But the education that would matter most came later. When Marcus was about 25, his Stoic tutor, Junius Rusticus, handed him a book, not just any book, a worn personal copy of the discourses of Epictetus, the lectures of a former slave who had become one of the most profound philosophers in the ancient world. Rusticus had carried this book with him, studied from it, turned down its pages, and in handing it to Marcus, he set in motion a chain of influence that would stretch across 2,000 years. Through that one act of lending, the teachings of a lame former slave reached the future emperor of Rome. And nothing was ever the same. The trajectory of Marcus's inner life pivoted at that moment. Everything he would later write in the Meditations, every insight about impermanence and duty and the quiet fortress of the mind, traces back to those pages. A worn book, handed from teacher to student in a quiet room in Rome, while outside the empire hummed with a million tasks and a million urgencies that have long since been forgotten. The Meditations begins with gratitude. Before Marcus Aurelius writes a single word about the nature of the universe or the discipline of the will, before he addresses duty or death or the passage of time, he does something disarmingly simple. He makes a list of every person who shaped him and what they gave him. It is the most personal passage in the entire work, a man quietly naming his debts before he turns inward to face himself. From my grandfather Verus, he writes, I learned good morals and the government of my temper. That is the very first sentence of the Meditations, not a grand philosophical declaration, a memory of an old man's gentleness. From his mother she learned piety and beneficence and simplicity in his way of living. From Diognetus, the painting teacher who changed everything, he learned not to waste time on trivial pursuits, not to listen to miracle workers and charlatans, not to keep quails or get excited about such things. In the world of a privileged Roman boy, where blood sport and animal fights were entertainment, Diognetus pointed toward something quieter. From Junius Rusticus, the man who brought him Epictetus, Marcus learned to read carefully and not be satisfied with a superficial understanding, to avoid being led astray by a taste for rhetoric, not to write treatises on speculative subjects, not to show off. These are the lessons of a man who valued depth over display, substance over performance. From Apollonius of Chalcedon, he learned freedom of will and undeviating steadiness of purpose. From Sextus of Chaeronea, a grandson of Plutarch himself, he learned tolerance and the example of a household governed by its head. Each teacher appears in the list like a stone in a mosaic, each contributing a small, essential piece to the portrait of the man Marcus was trying to become. But the longest and most beautiful passage in Book 1 is the tribute to his adoptive father, Antoninus Pius. It runs to several paragraphs, and it reads like a love letter from a son to the man who raised him. From Antoninus, Marcus learned gentleness and unshaken resolution in judgments taken after full examination. He learned to avoid the empty glory of external honors. He noted how Antoninus would hear anyone who had something to contribute to the public advantage. He remembered the older man's social tact, his patience in counsel, his reluctance to accept first impressions when deeper investigation was needed. The portrait that emerges is of a man utterly without pretense. Antoninus did not care about the glory of doing things, only that they were done rightly. He did not surround himself with sycophants. He did not build monuments to himself. His outward expression was cheerful, and his manner free of excess. He was, in Marcus's telling, simply and consistently good. What makes this passage extraordinary is what it reveals about Marcus himself. He could have resented Antoninus. The adoption that made Marcus emperor also stole the quiet philosophical life he wanted. But there is no resentment here, only gratitude so deep and precise that it feels almost like a prayer. Modern scholars have called this tribute one of the noblest that a great man has ever paid to another, and Marcus spent the rest of his life trying to be worthy of it. There is something healing about beginning with gratitude. Before the struggles, before the wars and plagues and betrayals that would consume his reign, Marcus starts by remembering the people who loved him, the grandfather who was gentle, the mother who was simple, the teacher who was patient, the father who was good. As if to say, before I face what is coming, let me remember where I came from. Let me remember that I was held. The tradition of beginning with thanksgiving is ancient. It appears in Stoic practice and in nearly every contemplative tradition the world has produced. Not because gratitude is easy, but because it reorients the mind. It turns attention from what is missing to what was given, from what went wrong to what went quietly right. Tonight, as you settle toward sleep, you might do the same. Not a formal exercise, just a quiet naming. The people who shaped you, the hands that held you, the voices that taught you something true. They do not need to be perfect. They just need to be remembered. And in the remembering, something loosens, something softens, something that was clenched all day lets go. In the year 138, the aging Emperor Hadrian made a decision that would alter the course of Roman history. He adopted a mild and capable senator named Titus Aurelius Antoninus as his heir. But there was a condition. Antoninus must in turn adopt 2 boys as his own heirs. One of them was Marcus, then 17 years old. With that single act, Marcus's life was no longer his own. His betrothal to one woman was annulled. He would instead marry Faustina, the daughter of his new adoptive father. The personal yielded to the political, as it would again and again throughout his life. A boy who wanted nothing more than to read philosophy and live quietly was being groomed for the most powerful position in the known world. Hadrian died later that year. Antoninus ascended the throne and reigned for 23 peaceful and prosperous years as Antoninus Pius, the Dutiful. During those long, quiet years, Marcus sat beside his adoptive father in the imperial council, learning the daily mechanics of governing an empire that stretched from the mists of Britain to the sands of Mesopotamia. He was made consul, given the title Caesar, appointed to the priestly colleges. Step by step, the philosopher was being turned into an emperor. Marcus found this prospect deeply unappealing. He would have preferred the life of a thinker, the quiet rooms, the daily discipline of thought, the companionship of books. But his Stoic training made the choice inescapable. Duty was something a Stoic could not decline. The universe had assigned him a role, and to refuse it would be to refuse the fundamental order of things. As he would later write, "Accept the things to which fate binds you, and love the people with whom fate brings you together, and do so with all your heart." When Antoninus Pius died on the 7th of March in 161, Marcus Aurelius became emperor. He was 39 years old, and in his first act he did something that revealed his character more clearly than any speech or edict could. He insisted that his adopted brother, Lucius Verus, be elevated to co-emperor, equal rank, equal power. It was the first time in Roman history that the empire was ruled by two men of equal standing. Marcus had no legal obligation to share power. He did so because he believed it was right. He was the last of the 5 good emperors, that extraordinary succession of rulers from Nerva through Trajan, Hadrian, and Antoninus Pius, who governed Rome through the long golden afternoon of the 2nd century. The historian Edward Gibbon would later write that their era was the period during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous. Marcus was its culmination, and in many ways its elegy. The reign he inherited was serene. The reign he lived was anything but. Within his first year, the Parthian Empire invaded Roman Armenia and destroyed an entire legion. His co-emperor, Lucius Verus, was dispatched to command the response. After years of hard campaigning, the Parthians were driven back, but the returning legions carried something worse than any enemy, a plague that would devastate the Roman world for 15 years. And then the Germanic tribes along the Danube began to move. And then a trusted general declared himself emperor. And then Marcus's own health began to fail. He endured it all, not because he was naturally brave, or because suffering came easily to him. He endured because he believed, with the calm certainty of a Stoic, that endurance was his job, that the universe does not make mistakes in its assignments, that the philosopher's duty is not to choose his circumstances, but to meet them with virtue. His wife, Faustina, accompanied him on campaigns. Together they had 14 children, of whom only 5 would survive to adulthood. The others were buried one by one, small lives extinguished by the ordinary cruelties of the ancient world. When Faustina died in 175 during a military campaign, Marcus was devastated. He had her deified. He established a charitable foundation for orphan girls in her name, and in his private journal he wrote of her with a warmth that no rumor could diminish. "That I have such a wife," he wrote, "so obedient, and so affectionate, and so simple." Tonight you have met your circumstances. Whatever the day brought, difficult or easy, expected or surprising, you met it, and now the assignment changes. The duty of the evening is different from the duty of the day. Now the universe asks only that you rest. Men look for retreats for themselves, Marcus wrote, in the country, at the seashore, in the hills, and you yourself are particularly inclined to feel this desire. Yet all this is quite unphilosophical when it is open to you at any hour you please to retreat into yourself. For nowhere can a man retire more full of peace or more free from care than into his own soul. This is perhaps the most important idea in the entire Meditations, the inner retreat, the citadel of the mind, the one place that no army can invade, no plague can reach, no emperor's edict can touch. Marcus returns to it again and again, from different angles, with different metaphors, but always the same truth. You do not need to go anywhere to find peace. Peace is already inside you. The philosopher Pierre Hadot titled his landmark study of the Meditations "The Inner Citadel," after this central metaphor. And the word citadel is not accidental. Marcus was a military man. He understood fortresses. He understood walls and gates and defensive positions, and he used that language deliberately. "The mind without passions is a fortress," he wrote in Book 8. "No place is more secure. Once we take refuge there, we are safe forever. Not to see this is ignorance. To see it and not seek refuge there is misfortune." Think about what this means. The most powerful man in the Western world, commanding legions in a brutal frontier war, plague sweeping through his army, betrayal lurking in his own court, and he writes that the safest place he knows is inside his own mind, not behind the stone walls of Carnuntum, not in the marble halls of the imperial palace in Rome, inside, in the quiet room of his own thoughts. He developed this idea further with one of his most beautiful images. The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts, he wrote. Your mind will take the shape of what you frequently hold in thought, for the human spirit is colored by such impressions. Dyed, not painted, not decorated, dyed. The color goes all the way through. It is not a surface change. It is a transformation of the very substance. If you fill your mind with anxious thoughts, you become anxiety. If you fill it with angry thoughts, you become anger. And if you fill it with calm thoughts, with thoughts of acceptance and gratitude and the quiet order of nature, you become calm.
This was not abstract theorizing, it was practical instruction. Marcus was prescribing himself a cognitive therapy 2,000 years before the term existed. Choose better thoughts, and your entire inner world changes color. He continues the passage by telling himself exactly what thoughts to dye his soul with. Thoughts about the interconnection of all things, about how everything belongs to the universe, about the naturalness of change. He was not trying to think his way out of difficulty. He was trying to think his way into acceptance, into peace, into the quiet clarity that comes when you stop resisting the texture of your own experience. And then the simplest formulation of all, the one that has traveled further than perhaps any other sentence Marcus wrote. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. The Stoics inherited this principle from Epictetus, who learned it in the hardest school imaginable, slavery. It is not things that disturb us, Epictetus taught, but our judgments about things. The event itself is neutral. The suffering comes from the story we tell about it. Change the story, and the suffering changes too. Tonight, as you lie in the dark, you do not need to go to the countryside or the seashore or the hills. You do not need to escape anywhere. The retreat is here. It has always been here. Nowhere you can go is more peaceful, more free of interruptions than your own soul. The gates of the citadel are open. Step inside. The lamp is lit. The room is warm. And outside, the world, with all its noise and urgency, grows quiet and distant, like a city seen from very far away. Time is a river, Marcus wrote, a violent current of events, glimpsed once and already carried past us, and another follows and is gone. He loved this image. He returned to it again and again in his journal, each time finding a new facet, a new angle of light on the same rushing water. The river of time. The Stoics had inherited the metaphor from Heraclitus, the pre-Socratic philosopher who declared that you cannot step into the same river twice. Everything flows, everything changes. The only constant is the change itself. Marcus was not writing about rivers in the abstract. He was camped beside one, the Danube, one of the great rivers of Europe, rolled past his camp at Cornuntum day and night, muscular with current, grey and cold and relentless. He could hear it from his tent. He could smell the faint mineral tang of it on the air. When he wrote about the river of time, he was looking at a real river and seeing in its current the reflection of everything he knew about human life. How quickly all things disappear, he wrote. In the universe, the bodies themselves, but in time, the remembrance of them. Not just the things themselves vanish, the memory of them vanishes too, and the person who remembers also vanishes. Everything is ephemeral, both what remembers and what is remembered. This is not despair. This is liberation. If everything passes, then nothing is worth the anguish we give it. The argument that consumed your morning, the worry that occupied your afternoon, the plan that fell apart, the words someone said that stung, all of it, every moment of it, is already being carried downstream, already dissolving into the vast indifferent river. You cannot hold it, you cannot retrieve it, you cannot even remember it for long. Marcus practiced what the philosopher Pierre Hadot calls the view from above. It was a formal Stoic exercise. You imagine yourself rising higher and higher above the earth, watching human affairs grow smaller and smaller below you, until the cities are specks, and the empires are dust, and the grand ambitions of the greatest men who ever lived are invisible against the turning of the cosmos. Think of the whole of existence, Marcus wrote, of which your share is tiny. Think of the whole of time, in which you have been assigned a brief and fleeting moment. Think of destiny. What fraction are you? The answer, of course, is almost nothing. A single breath in the life of the universe, a single note in an infinite symphony. But Marcus did not find this depressing. He found it freeing. If you are a single note, then play the note well and let the symphony carry on. If you are a brief moment, then be fully present in that moment and let it pass. All that comes to pass is as familiar and well known as the rose in spring and the grape in summer, he wrote. There is nothing genuinely new under the sun. Disease has come before. Loss has come before. Joy has come before. The seasons turn. The river flows, and we, the watchers, face the same fundamental reality, whether we are emperor or beggar, whether the year is 170 or 2,000 years later. The images Marcus chose are deliberately calming. Roses in spring, grapes in summer, the cycles of nature repeating with quiet reliability, season after season, century after century. Sleep itself is part of this ancient cycle,
as natural as the bloom, as inevitable as the harvest, as old as the river. Tonight, imagine yourself beside that river, not struggling against the current, not trying to hold back the water or retrieve what has already flowed past, just sitting on the bank, watching. The anxieties of the day drift by like leaves on the surface. The worries about tomorrow, the regrets about yesterday, all of them moving downstream, out of reach, out of sight. The river does not stop. It does not need to stop, and neither do you need to stop it. Just watch, and let the sound of the water, the ancient, steady, unhurried sound of time passing, carry you toward rest. The most important person in Marcus Aurelius's intellectual life was a man he never met, a former slave named Epictetus, who had died when Marcus was still a teenager, but whose words, preserved in lecture notes compiled by a devoted student, would become the philosophical foundation of everything Marcus believed. Epictetus was born into slavery around 55 CE in Hierapolis, in what is now modern Turkey. His very name means acquired or obtained. It was not a name his parents gave him. It was a label, the kind of word you might use for a piece of property. His real name, his mother's name, his father's name, all of these are lost to history. He was owned by Epaphroditus, a wealthy freedman who served as secretary to the Emperor Nero. Epaphroditus was himself a former slave who had clawed his way to power, a man who would later help Nero commit suicide and eventually be executed for that very act by the Emperor Domitian. The most famous story about Epictetus concerns his leg. According to ancient sources, Epaphroditus once twisted Epictetus's leg, whether in a fit of rage or as a deliberate cruelty. As the pain intensified and the bone began to give way, Epictetus said calmly, "You are going to break it." And when the bone snapped, he said simply, "There, did I not tell you that you would break it?" Some ancient accounts attribute his lameness to rheumatism rather than cruelty. The truth is unknowable now, separated from us by nearly 2,000 years. But the story endures because it captures something essential about this man and the philosophy he taught. The body can be broken, but the will, the inner citadel, remains untouched. Despite being enslaved, Epictetus was permitted to attend lectures by the Stoic teacher Musonius Rufus. After gaining his freedom, he began teaching in Rome. When the Emperor Domitian expelled all philosophers from the city in 89 CE, Epictetus went into exile in Nicopolis, Greece, where he established his school. He lived with almost nothing. It was said that he could leave his door unlocked because he owned nothing worth stealing. His teaching was direct, conversational, often sharp. Some things are in our control and others not, he taught. Things in our control are opinion, pursuit, desire, aversion, and, in a word, whatever are our own actions. Things not in our control are body, property, reputation, command, and, in a word, whatever are not our own actions. Near the end of his life, this man, who had owned nothing and been owned by others, did something unexpected. He adopted a child who had been exposed, left to die, as was the custom for unwanted infants. He took in a woman to help raise the boy. The philosopher of detachment chose to love. And it was this man's words, carried in a worn copy of lecture notes, that the tutor, Junius Rusticus, handed to the young Marcus Aurelius. Think about that chain of transmission. Epictetus spoke his lectures aloud in a small school in Greece. His student, Arrian, wrote them down. The notes were copied onto scrolls. The scrolls traveled across the Mediterranean. One copy found its way into the hands of Rusticus, and Rusticus, recognizing something essential in the words of a former slave, placed them in the hands of a future emperor. A slave's wisdom reaching the most powerful man in the world. A broken body teaching an emperor about the unbreakable mind. The essential substance of the meditations, the emphasis on the discipline of perception, the discipline of action, the discipline of will, comes from Epictetus. When Marcus quotes or paraphrases Stoic doctrine in his private journal, it is most often Epictetus he is channeling. Two men separated by birth and death and every social distinction the ancient world could draw, united by the conviction that virtue is the only true good, and that the present moment is the only time we truly possess. It is not things that disturb us, Epictetus taught, but our judgments about things. And somewhere on the Danube, by lamplight, an emperor wrote those words down and tried to live by them, and largely succeeded, and left the evidence in a journal that was never meant to be read. And here you are, reading it 2,000 years later. The chain continues. In the year 165, Roman soldiers returning from a campaign against the Parthian Empire in the east carried with them something far more devastating than any enemy army. The Antonine Plague, named for the ruling dynasty of Marcus Aurelius, would ravage the Roman world for the next 15 years. The physician Galen, who witnessed the epidemic firsthand, described the symptoms with clinical precision: fever, skin eruptions, diarrhea, a darkening of the skin in its later stages, black pustules, a racking cough, the delirium that preceded death. Modern scholars believe it was most likely smallpox, though some have argued for measles. Whatever it was, it spread with terrifying speed along the trade routes and military roads that connected every corner of the empire. The numbers are staggering. Modern estimates suggest that somewhere between 5 and 10% of the empire's entire population died. In cities and in the army, where people lived in close quarters, the death rates were even worse. At its peak, the plague killed an estimated 2,000 people per day in Rome alone. The devastation was not merely demographic. The plague hollowed out the empire's institutions. Professional armies were so depleted that Marcus had to recruit slaves and gladiators to fill the legions. Town councils in provincial cities could not meet for lack of members. Abandoned farms and depopulated towns dotted the countryside from Egypt to the Rhine. Marcus Aurelius, already fighting the Marcomannic Wars on the Danube frontier, now faced the collapse of the very society he was trying to protect. His response was extraordinary. He sold imperial palace treasures at auction to fund public aid rather than raising taxes on a devastated populace. He sold his wife's silk robes. He distributed food and medical supplies. He recruited migrants from outside the empire to settle on abandoned farmland. He buried the dead at public expense. He never wavered, and he never complained, at least not publicly. But the plague had barely receded when the second great crisis struck. Along the Danube, tribes that had been held in check for generations began to move. The Marcomanni, led by their king Balamar, formed a coalition of Germanic peoples, crossed the frozen river, and smashed a Roman force of 20,000 men. Then they did something that had not been done in nearly 3 centuries. They invaded Italy itself. Germanic warriors swept south, destroying the city of Odesir, and besieged Aquileia at the head of the Adriatic. It was the first hostile incursion into Italy since 101 BCE. The psychological shock was immense. Marcus took personal command. For the better part of 2 decades, from 166 until his death in 180, he waged war along the Danube. These were not glamorous wars of conquest. They were grinding, defensive struggles against an enemy that appeared, struck, and melted back into the wilderness. Marcus led from the front. He crossed into enemy territory. He campaigned against the Quadi on the River Gran in what is now Slovakia. He spent years at the legionary fortress of Carnuntum. And then came the betrayal. In 175, while Marcus was still fighting on the frontier, his trusted general, Avidius Cassius, declared himself emperor. Marcus received the news with remarkable composure. He told the Senate that if Cassius were the better leader, he would willingly yield the empire. He refused to execute any of Cassius's supporters. The crisis resolved itself in 3 months when Cassius's own officers murdered him and sent his head to Marcus. The emperor refused to look at it. He ordered it buried with dignity. "The best revenge," Marcus wrote, "is not to be like your enemy." Through all of this, the plague, the invasion, the betrayal, Marcus wrote his meditations. When he writes about impermanence, he is not engaging in abstract philosophy. He is a man watching his world die around him. When he writes about accepting what fate brings, he has accepted more than most people could bear. The Meditations is not a book written in comfort. It is a book written in extremity by a man who found philosophy to be the only thing strong enough to hold. Picture the scene. It is sometime in the early 170s. The Roman military camp at Carnuntum sprawls along the south bank of the Danube, a city of canvas and timber and stone. The fortress measures roughly 480 meters by 360 meters, enclosed by stone walls and defensive ditches. Beyond the walls, the Canabe, the civilian settlement, stretches out with its taverns and workshops and bathhouses and temples. The Danube itself is a broad grey presence, muscular with current, carrying the cold of the northern forests. Night falls early this far north, especially in the winter months when Marcus most often campaigned. The temperature drops sharply after sunset. Frost rimes the leather tents. Ice forms along the river's edges. The camp is never truly silent. Sentries call the watch. Horses stamp in the cavalry lines. A smith works late, the clank of his hammer rhythmic and distant. Soldiers murmur around their fires. The smell of wood smoke hangs in the cold air, mixed with the sharper scent of olive oil from the lamps, the earthier smells of leather and horse, and the faint ever-present tang of the river. In the praetorium, the commander's quarters, a lamp burns. The emperor's quarters are part of a structure that archaeologists have identified as roughly 63 meters by 40, but the room where Marcus writes is not grand. He has never cared for luxury. The lamp is a simple clay oil lamp, its flame small and steady, casting a warm circle of light that barely reaches the walls. On the table before him are the wax tablets. The stylus scratches softly in the quiet. His shadow is large and flickering on the wall behind him. And here, in this small circle of light, in a military camp on the edge of the known world, the most powerful man alive writes to himself. "Do not waste the remainder of your life in thoughts about others," he writes, "when you are not thinking with reference to some aspect of the common good." He dips his stylus. A sentry calls. The wind rises outside,
carrying the sound of the river. How small a part of the boundless and unfathomable time is assigned to every man, he writes, for it is very soon swallowed up in the eternal, and how small a part of the whole substance, and how small a part of the universal soul, and on what a small clod of the whole earth. These are the meditations. They were never meant to be read by anyone else. They are not a systematic treatise. They are not even a diary in the conventional sense. They are exercises, the philosophical equivalent of a musician's scales, repeated night after night to keep the instrument in tune. Marcus returns again and again to the same themes, the transience of all things, the importance of acting justly, the need to accept what cannot be changed, the discipline of keeping one's mind focused on the present moment. Book 2 bears an inscription that has survived the centuries, written among the Quadi on the Granavera. Book 3 was likely composed at Carnuntum. We can trace his movements through these notations like following footprints in snow. He wrote in Sirmium, in modern Serbia. He wrote in campaign tents pitched in barbarian territory north of the Danube. He wrote through plague and war and betrayal. And then there is the most humanizing passage in all ancient philosophy. At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, I have to go to work as a human being. What do I have to complain of if I am going to do what I was born for? Or is this what I was created for? To huddle under the blankets and stay warm? The Emperor of Rome, the most powerful man alive, arguing with himself about whether to get out of bed. But it is nicer here, the voice of comfort whispers, and Marcus answers, so you were born to feel nice? Instead of doing things and experiencing them? And then the concession. But a man needs rest as well. I agree, he does. Yet nature assigns limits to rest as well as eating and drinking. Nature assigns limits to rest, but nature also requires it. And tonight, the limit has been reached from the other direction. The work is done. The day is over. Marcus himself would agree. The blankets and the warmth that he resisted in the morning are now your earned reward. The impediment to action advances action, Marcus wrote. What stands in the way becomes the way. This single sentence has traveled further than almost any other in the Meditations. It inspired a modern best-selling book. It has been quoted by athletes and executives and soldiers and therapists. But when Marcus wrote it, he was not crafting a motivational slogan. He was reminding himself, in the midst of a life that contained more obstacles than most people could imagine,
that the Stoic path does not go around difficulty, it goes through. The principle comes from the heart of Stoic physics. Nature turns everything thrown into it to use. A fire does not reject what is tossed on it. It consumes it. It converts it to flame and heat. The rational mind can do the same. Every setback, every frustration, every obstacle becomes raw material. The mind adapts and converts to its own purposes the obstacle to our acting. Marcus applied it not as theory, but as daily practice. The plague was an obstacle. He turned it into an occasion for generosity and administrative innovation. The war was an obstacle. He turned it into a demonstration of Stoic endurance. The betrayal of Avidius Cassius was an obstacle. He turned it into a demonstration of mercy so striking that it echoed across centuries. He captured this idea in one of the most visually powerful images in the Meditations. Be like the headland on which the waves continually break, he wrote. It stands firm, and about it the boiling waters sink to sleep. Sink to sleep. Even the sea eventually rests against the rock. The headland does not fight the waves. It does not push them back. It does not resent them. It simply stands, and the waves, no matter how fierce, eventually exhaust themselves against it. Marcus continues the passage with a rare moment of something close to gratitude for his difficulties. Lucky am I, he wrote, because though this befell me, I continue free from sorrow, neither crushed by the present, nor fearing what to come. The obstacle has not broken him. It has revealed his strength. The wave has shown the headland what it is made of. This radical acceptance is what later thinkers would call amor fati, the love of fate. Marcus did not use that precise phrase. It comes from Nietzsche centuries later, but the concept saturates the Meditations. Accept what comes. Work with nature, not against it. Do not wish for a different life. Wish to be worthy of the life you have. Accept the things to which fate binds you, he wrote, and love the people with whom fate brings you together, but do so with all your heart. The word love is important here. This is not mere resignation. This is not gritting your teeth and enduring. This is choosing deliberately to love the life you have been given, to love the difficult people in it, to love the obstacles, to love even the losses, because they are part of the fabric, and without them the fabric would not hold. Marcus knew this better than most. He had lost most of his children. He had been betrayed by a trusted general. He had watched plague consume his empire. He had spent the best years of his life in a military camp when he would have rather have been in a library. And still he wrote, with all your heart. Not despite the suffering, through it. Everything is fitting for me, my universe, which fits thy purpose, he wrote. Nothing in thy good time is too early or too late for me. Everything is fruit for me which thy seasons, nature, bear. From thee, in thee, to thee are all things. There is a completeness to this passage that goes beyond philosophy. It sounds almost like a prayer. From thee, in thee, to thee. A man surrendering his resistance to the order of things, not because the order is always kind, but because resisting it is a form of suffering that he does not wish to carry. Tonight, whatever obstacles you faced today, consider the possibility that they have already done their work. The wave has already broken. The headland still stands. And now the waters are sinking, sinking, sinking to sleep. The fury is spent. The foam dissolves. The sea grows calm. And the headland, which is you, remains unchanged, undiminished, standing firm in the quiet dark. Marcus Aurelius returns to death more than any other topic in the Meditations. He catalogues the dead. He meditates on decomposition. He reflects on the brevity of fame, and he frames death again and again, not as an enemy, but as a homecoming, a natural dissolution, a return to the elements from which all things are made. Think continually how many physicians are dead, he wrote, after often contracting their eyebrows over the sick, and how many astrologers, after predicting with great pretensions the deaths of others, and how many philosophers, after endless discourses on death or immortality. The rhythm is deliberate. Name after name, profession after profession. The physicians who studied death are dead. The astrologers who predicted death are dead. The philosophers who debated death are dead. The heroes who defied death are dead. Where are they now? Where are Heraclitus and Pythagoras and Socrates? Where are the great generals and the beloved kings and the men who seemed in their time to be the center of the world? Gone, all of them, carried downstream by the river. But Marcus does not deliver this litany as a lament. He delivers it as a release. If even the greatest eventually rested, then you may rest too. If even the most famous are forgotten, then you need not fear being forgotten. If even the most powerful are powerless against time, then the power you lack is not a failure, it is the human condition. Of human life the time is a point, he writes, and the substance is in a flux, and the perception dull, and the composition of the whole body subject to putrefaction, and the soul a whirl, and fortune hard to divine, and fame a thing devoid of judgment. And to say all in a word,
Everything which belongs to the body is a stream, and what belongs to the soul is a dream and vapor. And life is a warfare and a stranger's sojourn, and after fame is oblivion. What belongs to the soul is a dream and vapor. This line, written by a man who was arguably the most accomplished ruler of his age, dissolves the boundary between waking and sleeping. The soul is already dreamlike. Dreams are not a departure from reality. They are a reflection of the soul's essential nature. And then, after all the catalogues of the dead and the meditations on dissolution, Marcus lifts his eyes, and what he sees is not darkness, it is beauty. Dwell on the beauty of life, he writes. Watch the stars and see yourself running with them. This passage is a rare moment of pure wonder in the Meditations. Marcus stops philosophizing. He stops arguing with himself. He stops listing the dead and measuring the brevity of fame. He simply looks up, and what he sees is magnificent. The same stars he watched from the banks of the Danube are the same stars above you now. The constellations have shifted slightly over the centuries, but the same ancient light is still falling. The same silence surrounds them. The same vastness opens above any human being who pauses long enough to look up. Think of the universe as one living creature, Marcus wrote, embracing one being and one soul. How all is absorbed into the one consciousness of this living creature. How all compasses it with a single purpose, and how all things work together to cause all that comes to pass, and their wonderful web and texture. One living creature, one consciousness, every star, every river, every sleeping person, every breath drawn in the dark is part of this single organism. Your breathing is the universe breathing. Your rest is the universe resting. You are not alone in the dark. You are held within the body of everything that exists. Do not despise death, Marcus wrote, but be well content with it, since this too is one of those things which nature wills. Sleep is death's younger sibling, the same surrender, the same letting go, the same trust that the self will survive the dissolution of consciousness. And if death itself is natural, then sleep is the most natural thing in the world. Welcome it. Do not resist. It is one of the things required by nature, and nature, as Marcus knew, does not make requests lightly. The Meditations were never meant to survive. Marcus Aurelius wrote them for himself. Private notes, philosophical exercises, the equivalent of a musician
practicing scales in a room with the door closed. When he died in 180 CE, the journal could easily have been destroyed, lost, or simply forgotten. There was no instruction to publish, no dedication to a patron, no title page, just the private scrawl of a tired emperor on wax tablets that could be melted smooth and reused. How the Meditations survived the first 7 centuries after Marcus's death remains one of the great mysteries of classical scholarship. We do not know who found them. We do not know who first copied them from wax to papyrus or parchment. We do not know how many copies were made or how many were lost. For 700 years, the book existed somewhere in the margins of history, copied perhaps by a handful of anonymous scribes, never widely circulated, never famous. Then, around the year 900, a Byzantine scholar named Aurelius of Caesarea found a manuscript and fell in love with it. The copy Aurelius found was ancient and deteriorating. In a letter to Demetrius, the Archbishop of Heraclea, Aurelius described his discovery. "I have had for some time an old copy of the Emperor Marcus's most profitable book, so old indeed that it is altogether falling to pieces. This I have had copied, and am able to hand down to posterity in its new dress." One deteriorating manuscript, one curious scholar, one decision to copy it before it crumbled to dust. Without Aurelius, the Meditations might have vanished entirely. The private thoughts of a Roman emperor, 2 millennia of accumulated wisdom, preserved by the slimmest of margins. Aurelius's copy became the basis for the manuscript tradition that kept the work alive through the medieval period. The oldest complete surviving manuscript sits in the Vatican Library and dates to the 14th century. The first printed edition appeared in Zurich in 1558, published by the scholar Wilhelm Zeilander from a manuscript that was reportedly lost shortly afterward. Even in being published, the Meditations nearly escaped. The source disappeared as soon as the copy was made. But once the book entered general circulation, its influence spread with remarkable speed. Michel de Montaigne, the great French essayist, absorbed Marcus's style of introspective questioning into his own work. Frederick the Great of Prussia carried the Stoics in his saddlebags as he rode into battle. In the 20th century, the book found readers who needed it most. President Clinton identified the Meditations as the book that had most influenced him outside the Bible. Nelson Mandela received a smuggled copy while imprisoned on Robben Island during his 27 years of confinement. A philosopher-emperor who spent his life on military frontiers writing about endurance and acceptance, speaking across the centuries to a prisoner fighting for justice in South Africa. The parallels between Marcus and Mandela are striking. Both were leaders who would have preferred a quieter life. Both endured years of hardship far from home. Both found in philosophy not an escape from suffering, but a way to bear it with grace. And both understood that the true measure of a person is not the circumstances they face, but how they choose to face them. Modern cognitive behavioral therapy, the most empirically validated form of talk therapy, traces a direct line back to Stoic practice. The technique of examining your impressions, of questioning whether your initial emotional response is rational, of separating what you can control from what you cannot, maps almost exactly onto the therapeutic methods developed in the 20th century. Marcus Aurelius' nightly habit of reviewing his day, examining his reactions, and preparing himself for the challenges of tomorrow is journaling therapy. The psychologists just gave it a new name. What began as one man's private struggle to be better, scribbled by lamplight in a tent on the Danube, has become a guide for millions. And the remarkable thing is that it almost didn't happen. One more flood, one more fire, one more careless librarian, and the book would be gone, and we would never know what we had lost. But it survived, barely, improbably, beautifully, like so many things that matter. By the late 170s, Marcus Aurelius was exhausted. Nearly 2 decades of continuous warfare had worn down his body. The plague may have touched him as well. He was not yet 60, but the ancient sources describe a man who looked far older than his years. Gaunt, gray, sustained more by will than vitality. In 178, he returned to the Danube for what would be his final campaign. He wintered at Vindobona, the legionary fortress at the site of modern Vienna. It was a cold, exposed posting, far from the warmth of Rome. And there, in early 180, Marcus fell ill. His response was characteristically Stoic. He was concerned not for himself, but for those around him. He ordered his friends and advisers to keep their distance, fearing his illness might be contagious. He summoned his son Commodus to receive the symbols of imperial authority. He spoke to those who gathered at his bedside, not of his own suffering, but of the transience of all things, echoing the themes he had written about in the quiet hours of so many nights. On his final day, his military tribune came to ask for the watchword, the password that would be passed through the camp for the night. Marcus replied, "Go to the rising sun. I am already setting." Then he pulled the covering over his head, as though composing himself for sleep, and died. It was the 17th of March, in the year 180. He was 58 years old. Go to the rising sun.
I am already setting. Even at the end he found the metaphor. Even at the end the philosopher was composing. The sun sets. This is what suns do. There is no tragedy in it. There is only the natural order, the ancient rhythm of light and dark, the same rhythm that governs the stars and the tides and the breath of every sleeping creature on earth. Very little is needed to make a happy life, he had written. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking. And forget everything else. Keep hold of this alone and remember it. Each of us lives only now, this brief instant. The rest has been lived already or is impossible to see. This brief instant, this moment, not the morning's worries, not tomorrow's plans, not the long catalogue of things done and undone, just this, the warmth of the bed, the weight of the body settling, the breath coming and going without effort, the way it has been coming and going since the day you were born.
Marcus Aurelius found peace not by escaping his life, but by looking directly at it, by writing down the hardest truths he knew and reading them back to himself until they became part of him, by acknowledging that everything passes, everything changes, everything flows like the river, and that this is not a tragedy, but a mercy, because if everything passes, then the pain passes too, and what remains in the quiet after the pain is something that cannot be named, something deeper than thought, something that was here before your first memory and will be here after your last. The lamp in the tent on the Danube has gone out. The emperor is gone. The camp is gone. The river has changed its course 100 times. The empire itself is dust. But the words remain, scratched into wax by a tired man in the dark, copied by a Byzantine scholar just before the pages crumbled, passed from hand to hand across 2,000 years, reaching you now, in this room, in this quiet, at this hour. The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. Let yours be the color of rest, of peace, of the deep indigo sky above the Danube on a winter night, with the stars wheeling slowly overhead, the same stars Marcus watched, the same silence, the same invitation. Dwell on the beauty of life, watch the stars, and see yourself running with them. The watchword has been given. The sun is setting. The sentries are quiet. The river flows on in the dark. And you like the emperor before you, may pull the covering gently over your head. Compose yourself for sleep and rest.